Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining me in Chronicles and Critiquing Episode 2, where we're going to take a look at the first Mobile Suit Gundam compilation movie, which is just called Mobile Suit Gundam 1. Movies 2 and 3 do have subtitles, but this one's just movie 1, I guess kind of like a Star Wars New Hope thing. This movie came out in 1981. It is a compilation of the first 13 episodes of the original Mobile Suit Gundam from 1979, and the current version that's kind of floating around is the special edition from 2000, which I believe video-wise is the same. It was digitally remastered, and they re-recorded most of the lines and kind of changed some of the sound effects. It should be hitting Netflix today, so I thought I would give it another watch my old Blu-ray here, and see what we think about it. I've watched the original Mobile Suit Gundam many years ago. I've never seen this compilation movie, so it was the first time I've seen it, though I am kind of familiar with the story, as well as some of the differences between the movie and the TV show. So let's start off with just an introduction, a plot summary, go over some of the pros and cons, some of the changes from the TV show to the movie, and then I'll give my final thoughts at the end. This is going to be a spoiler review. I'll talk about spoilers and things that happened in the first movie. I will not spoil the second or third movies, or anything that sort of happens later on or in the other Gundam shows. So if you want to watch the movie first, then come back here. And if you're interested in these two guys, we got a Zaku 2 and an RX-78-2 Bandai Robot Spirits, and I do have an unboxing of these on the channel, where I get into a little bit of a Gundam primer and kind of what I do and don't like about these two figures in front of me. So the original Mobile Suit Gundam, which is in this first compilation movie, it starts off in Universal Century 79, and we're very quickly kind of brought up to speed that that humanity has kind of expanded into space, and there are a number of space colonies where people live and kind of go about their day. In a little bit of sort of like a U.S. Revolutionary War situation, the colonies do not have any say in their government, and they rebel against the Earth Federation, or I guess more specifically, one colony, Side 3, which is the furthest away from Earth, rebels. They call themselves the Principality of Zeon. So at the beginning of this movie, we are starting on Side 7, where we meet Amuro Ray, who is the main character and pilot of the RX-78-2 Gundam, and sort of the main character in a number of Gundam series and movies. He's really busy doing like some computer stuff. They're trying to kind of build him up as sort of being like a little nerdy so that it's more reasonable when he magically picks up this Gundam and knows how to operate it basically without any training. And he's sort of lost in his work, doesn't realize that the entire colony is being evacuated because they're being attacked. So there's basically two of these guys, two Zakus. They're supposed to just be doing some reconnaissance because they heard about the new weapons being developed. They wind up kind of going off script and attacking, does a lot of damage to the colonies, winds up sort of killing all of the soldiers that were to be manning the new Earth Federation weapons. Sort of specifically, they have a new spaceship called the White Base. They have the Gundam, the gun cannon, and the gun tank. So basically, the military, there's basically like one military guy left, Bright Noah. He's an ensign. He's only been in the military for 6 months. He basically starts running the show, and there's a bunch of civilians that happen to be standing around, and they are now the pilots of the Gundam and the gun cannon and the gun tank, and they are operating the various things on the ship. Amuro finds a manual for the Gundam, so he's like sitting in the Gundam, like reading the manual, trying to operate this thing. He winds up being able to kind of fend off the attackers, and they're like, okay, I guess you pilot this weapon now, even though it's like this super secret weapon, and he's like a 15-year-old kid. They're like, oh, it's probably fine. We'll just let him operate this. And then the movie kind of covers the first portion of their adventures. So they kind of fend off this attack on Side 7. Then they go to an Earth Federation base called Luna 2, where they get their orders, which is to go to Earth, and that these civilians are going to stay and continue to operate the ship, and that they're not getting sort of additional manpower or additional kind of forces. And then they they kind of have a battle in Earth's atmosphere. They enter into, they have a battle at Earth's atmosphere. So probably a good place to bring in Shar Aznable, who's kind of one of the primary antagonists of the show. He is like an ace pilot. We don't really learn a lot about him. He's this like masked mystery guy. He kind of starts up a rivalry with the white base. He's trying to, capture them for glory, or, it's a little unclear what he's trying to do, but he's kind of like your typical evil army guy, right now in the show. He tries to prevent them from entering the Earth. He's trying to capture their ship and all the weapons. He is unable to stop them from entering Earth's atmosphere, but he is able to alter their course, where they fall, instead of going to the Earth Federation base in Jaburo, which is where they're aiming for. Instead, they wind up in Zeon territory on the Earth, specifically under kind of the control of Garma Zabi, who is one of the sons of the leader of Zeon. So they sort of have, a few skirmishes with Garma and his forces, which leads to Garma's death. And kind of right before Garma dies, we learn that kind of Shar was planning his death and was kind of trying to get him killed. We learn that Shar has some sort of ulterior motive. We don't quite know what it is just yet. Obviously something that will probably be explored in the kind of future movies. Then there's a big funeral for Garma, which is basically used by Zeon as kind of a propaganda. They give this like big speech about how the people in space are superior, and how they, their cause is righteous, and they will be the leaders of humanity. And kind of right about this time, the white base meets sort of their next set of foes, which is a set of troops led by a officer named Rambaral, who kind of famously is piloting a mobile suit, which we don't know the name of yet, but we do know that it is not Azaku. That's sort of the plot in a nutshell. I mean, obviously I've just kind of summarized it there. I would definitely encourage people to watch the actual movie. But so, this is where it all began with Gundam, right? I was surprised. I didn't remember liking the original Gundam this much. I thought that the story held up really well, actually. I mean, it's a fairly basic story, but they do have a lot of kind of cool little touches to it. I think, sort of hinting at some of the ulterior motives of some of the characters, specifically Shar and some of the other Zabi family members, is going to kind of lead to some of the tension in the future movies. And just there's a lot of little things. So, for example, when Rambaral and the White Base are fighting on Earth, there's like a thunderstorm, but most of the people have never been to Earth before, and they don't know what thunder is. So they're like, oh, this is like some sort of crazy new weapon, and they're confused. So just like little things like that help kind of build up the world and be like, yeah, these people live in space. They have a completely different view of living in Earth than we do. They've never seen oceans. They've never seen thunder. I think another thing that I would definitely have to talk about in this movie is, again, when you hear the summary, it just sort of sounds like a typical, okay, there's like a war going on, and there's people fighting back and forth. What I think Gundam really focused on versus a lot of other shows from the era, which is a teenage boy gets super secret weapon and becomes a superhero, is really the kind of psychological toll that it's taken on Amuro. I mean, in many ways, you sort of see him developing like PTSD in real time, and really nobody around him is sympathetic to that. And he's like trembling, having like anxiety attacks, and they're just like, all right, man up, suck it up, and go kill those soldiers for us. And most of the time they seem to try to resolve the problem with Amuro not wanting to fight by just assaulting him. He gets punched and slapped a lot. I was keeping a count. I think it seems like not just Amuro, but everybody in Universal Century 79 seems to solve their problems by punching people. I think there were like about 6 punches or slaps that sort of came out of nowhere for the various characters. 2 or 3 of them were against Amuro. And I think Amuro got a few punches in on a Zeon soldier, but I'm not counting that since that was kind of technically a battle. But yeah, I think that the kind of psychological aspect of sort of what's going on with Amuro is really interesting. And it's definitely something that is referenced in future Gundams, and something that you really didn't see in a show at that time, that I think gives it a little bit more of like a mature edge. And it makes it a little bit more than just there's some robots, fighting in space, which is certainly part of Gundam's appeal, but certainly not with many of the people who love Gundam, kind of draws them to it. So with all that in mind, kind of have some pros and cons, of this compilation movie, and kind of is it worth your time now that it's on Netflix and you could watch it pretty easily and not have to dig up the Blu-ray or something else. So first of all, I thought that it was a really good story. Again, it's a simple plot, but there's a lot of nuance to it, and it's kind of starting to layer on. And if you want to get into Universal Century, this is Universal Century is a storyline that covers hundreds of episodes of different shows and different movies, and it kind of all starts here. And everything is important and everything counts. You can certainly watch the later installments without seeing the original, but you're really going to miss out on a lot of the character developments and character interactions unless you watch the original. And this is just a much more approachable and watchable version than the original TV show, right? The original TV show is 43 episodes. Sometimes it has a little bit of a Monster of the Week kind of flair to it. This kind of cuts out a lot of the fat and just kind of gives you the plot without moving so fast that you can't follow what's going on. I thought that it does a good job of setting up the 1-year war that's happening in 0079. They kind of at the beginning have a little bit of have like a narrator sort of explain what's going on. It's obviously a little bit more complicated than what they've given out so far, but I think it's enough to just sort of, why are these guys fighting? Why is this important? Why do I care about it? That's kind of answered. And in the last scene where there's the speech at Garma's funeral, you start to get a little bit more of the hints of the bigger points of this war and some of the characters that led to it. And I don't want to kind of spoil that, but that will definitely, I've not seen compilation movies 2 and 3, but at least based on the show, I'm sure that's something that will be explored. I thought what was also great about this movie in particular is that you get a lot of sort of the Gundam memes and kind of the famous Gundam lines just in like this 2-hour movie. You get the famous "This is no Zaku" line from Ramba Ral, which is referenced, sort of in other Gundams and, just on the internet generally. You get a lot of good Char quotes, mistakes of one's youth, stay one step ahead of your enemy, that kind of stuff. And you get a lot of iconic poses. There's the Gundam kind of like slicing the Zaku in half. There's the Gundam kind of stabbing the Zaku through the cockpit. There's the first Char kick. So, you could kind of watch this and kind of feel like maybe you're almost like part of the club, which I think is really cool, especially for just a 2-hour movie that's pretty minor commitment, especially now that you could just watch it on Netflix. And the animation, I think the animation is good. I think it holds up. There's not problems with it, but it's certainly not as flashy as some of the 90s or the 2000 and 2010 kind of Gundams. So again, I think that the animation, I'm still going to put as a pro because I think that it holds up. But don't expect to see, if you've watched stuff like Unicorn or even Seed or Iron Blooded Orphans, don't expect to see battles like that at this point. There's not a lot of mobile suits. Everyone's using fairly basic weaponry, but it's still fun. So let's get to the cons now that kind of went over the pros. And I started to hint at, one of them, which is just the animation. Again, just something to keep in mind if you're trying to, show this maybe to somebody who's not familiar with Gundam or not familiar with anime. This is definitely not the visual showcase that you're going to do, but it's not like laughably bad or anything like that. The kind of bigger cons that I had for the movie, the first one is I don't think they give a good sense of time. Like, there's the attack on Side 7, and then they go to Luna 2, and then they go into the atmosphere, and then they fight these different people. But it's kind of unclear how much time has elapsed. And I think that that's important because I think that if they did a better job of showing how long the White Base has been fighting, it would help kind of show Amuro's mental fatigue a little bit more, because the show makes it, obviously you're in space, so there's no sunset, sunrise, so there's no visual clues as to how much time has gone by, and it's sort of like, okay, if this happened in a week, that's a pretty hectic week, right? If it happened over the course of a few months, that you could definitely see how it's starting to like drag down, on Amuro and some of the other crew members. And then the last, con are just some of the cuts that they made to the show, and I think this might be a good time to get into some of them. I think there's kind of two really big areas of the cuts. One is there's not a lot of character development for any of the minor characters, and specifically, the people that pilot some of the other weapons. So you have, the pilot of the gun cannon and the gun tank and stuff like that. They kind of ignore developing those characters just so they could really focus on building up some of the villains, Char and Amuro. They obviously cut some of the battles that happen in space, and I think that those are kind of mostly filler battles and they don't really affect the plot, but they sort of help explain the rivalry that develops between Char and Amuro, because they kind of have a minor skirmish inside Seven, and then by the time that the white base is trying to get to Earth and is doing atmospheric entry, it's sort of like, oh, Char's here and he's Amuro's like big rival, and Amuro's like super motivated to fight him and is really distracted about fighting him. And I don't think it's much of a spoiler to say that the main villain and the main character continue to fight over the course of the show, and not showing the early sparks of that rivalry, I think, does hurt the development a little bit. Again, to characterization, there's some kind of background characters that they don't really explain. Like there's like some guy who kind of shows up at some point and everyone kind of knows him, but we don't really know him. And then on top of that, there's a few things that kind of change in the plot. Sort of specifically, the way everything goes down at Luna 2 happens a lot differently in the show. The original captain of the white base actually dies in the show versus him just sort of being off screen. None of that really affects the plot. But they did have to cut some stuff from time, so you're not maybe getting the full Gundam experience. So I think that's something helpful to keep in mind. So I guess my final thoughts are this movie is definitely worth your time. If you have any interest in getting into Universal Century, which I highly recommend you do because it's layered with nuances and so much interesting stuff. This is the beginning and it's super watchable. I sat down for 2 hours. I had a big grin on my face. I loved every second of it, and it was even better than I remembered. However, I would say that this might not be a good place to start if you are looking for a really flashy Gundam with like super slick animation and super cool battles. If that's what you want out of Gundam, this is probably not a good place to start. And this might be important if you're trying to get a friend into anime or trying to get a friend into Gundam. This might not be the best thing to really sell them on it. It might make more sense to show them something like, Seed or Wing or even the first episode of Unicorn to sort of get them hooked, and then say, okay, let's start at the beginning and kind of take your history lesson of everything going on. And I guess the one final thing that I do want to say, as far as just Mobile Suit Gundam being the basis for everything that was to follow, the Universal Century timeline is obviously directly based on Mobile Suit Gundam, and there's a lot of alternate timelines like Gundam Wing and G Gundam and Gundam Seed and Iron-Blooded Orphans and Gundam 00, and even though those aren't directly continuations of this plot, there's a lot of common plot threads. So I think that even if you're interested in the non-Universal Century stuff, it's fun to watch this just to be able to kind of get a lot of those references. And some of them are really straightforward, right? It's like, oh, they're attacking a colony to get a prototype weapon. And some of them are a little bit more subtle. And I just think that that's something that's kind of a fun part of the Gundam fandom, is sort of recognizing that and trying to find the similarities and the parallelisms between the different shows. So all in all, I'd probably give this movie, it like an 8.5 out of 10. I really don't have any strong complaints about it, but it's just not as flashy and slick as some of the later Gundams. Like I said, it's going to be available on Netflix. So I would definitely recommend, taking a few. It's about 2 hours and 20 minutes. So it takes 2 hours and 20 minutes to check it out. Like I said, it's a compilation of TV shows, so there definitely are logical places where you can kind of pause and take a break. You can kind of sometimes tell maybe where the episodes or the arcs of the TV show ended. Anyway, thanks so much for checking out this video. If you like this, I do have a spoiler review up of the new Gundam movie, Mobile Suit Gundam Hathaway, that's on the channel. I don't typically do a lot of anime reviews. I mostly do figure unboxings. For instance, I've done these two. You can catch this video on the channel as well, and I post new videos of unboxings every Wednesday. And next Wednesday, we're actually going to be doing a non-Gundam. We're going to be doing the Ava 01 test type metal build. So please join me for that. Thanks so much, and please keep collecting.